During the 1970s, park rowdyism was something that many Canadians became familiar with. Boozy parties on public beaches, midnight vandalism, campground hooligans, and noise making yahoos seemingly had become entrenched features of Canadian national, provincial, and regional parks from coast to coast. Some park visitors, peeved at having to share a beach or a campground with wild partiers, complained to newspapers, politicians, and park agencies, invoking their rights as taxpayers, as proper nature lovers. Um, some voted with their feet and sought out private campgrounds where there were stricter controls on access and behavior. Ironically, during the 1970s, many middle and working class campers, beachgoers, and other park visitors who were averse to rowdy behavior sought to escape from parks that had been established specifically to provide a space where that they could escape to during the 1950s and the 1960s. The silent majority was what many newspaper stories and letters to the editor called these harassed, displaced nature lovers, using a popular and seemingly apt phrase of the Nixon years. In response to public complaints and a growing perception that Canadian parks were no longer family or senior friendly spaces, the late 1970s and the early 1980s would see an array of new park practices and regulations instituted in the hope of dislodging and dispersing drunken, rowdy, uh, um, young, almost exclusively park visitors from these special recreational assets of the state. There was this crisis, I guess, of parks that they were no longer meeting the established image that had been developed during the post-war years as major recreational assets that were freely available to all citizens. They were increasingly being characterized and perceived as spaces uh, of almost danger, as I'll flag later on. Spaces where vandals and young people were allowed to run riot, spaces that had become uh, almost unpredictable, um, almost unpredictable mirrors of urban and suburban communities that people were trying to get away from when they visited parks, campgrounds, and beaches. Now, this presentation is drawn from a larger project I'm working on about the history of bad behavior in Canadian parks in the period about 1950 to 1990. And the phrase bad behavior there is always contained in scare quotes. It's intended to convey a host of topics like noise, vandalism, littering, drunkenness, drug use, um, controversial sexual activity, um, dangerous driving, and general instances of what park managers tended to refer to as rowdyism. By taking a history from below approach to the history of Canadian parks, my aim here is to provide a fuller picture of park users, of recreationalists in this time period, who are often overlooked in the post-World War II period, are treated as a kind of undifferentiated mass. There's so many park visitors at this time that they sort of get treated almost more as a problem than as a clientele with a wide range of interests by park experts and later by some historians too. Looking at this topic complicates our understanding of Canadians' attitudes towards recreation and the environment during the post-war decades, or I guess the between post-war and present day period, which we're often told saw the rise of environmental consciousness in politics. I believe that understanding Canada's popular culture of nature actually requires paying as much attention to dune buggies, dirt bikes, and boogie vans as to sea kayaking and backcountry trekking and leave no trace camping. A clutch of Canadian historians in recent years have been looking at these sorts of topics, unpacking and looking more deeply at the history of recreation, including Dale Barber with his work on beach resorts, Marianne Shantz with her work on nudism, Peter Stevens, who's been looking at consumer culture in Ontario's cottage country, Linda Mahood, who has a new book, Thumbing a Ride, on the history of young, youthful people hitchhiking during the 60s and the 70s. Most recently, I've been really fascinated by Kyle Riesmandel's new book, Neighborhood of Fear, which explores suburban Americans' pervasive sense of being under threat from criminals, drugs, teenage punks, and environmental degradation during the period from the 1970s through the 1990s. I think that examining park rowdyism can also help provide a better understanding of the broad culture of rebellion during the long 1970s in Canada. There's been a lot of recent interest in political protest and idealistic dissent in the late 60s and the early 70s. But what about during the subsequent decade, with its economic downturns, stagflation, and deindustrialization and energy crises, its culture wars over mass media, over alcohol and drugs as we get into the early 80s and the Reagan years, the Reagan-Mulroney years. This is a period when young people have fewer employment opportunities and are often portrayed as being sort of astray or adrift. Many American historians of the 1970s have argued that they were characterized by malaise, by cynicism, nihilism even, by a desire for escapism, and also a widespread embrace across the political spectrum of challenging the system and authority. So if this was the case in the United States, to what degree was it the case in Canada as well? So a little bit of broad context on parks during the period 1950 to 1985. Parks were enormously popular as recreational destinations in this time period. But after a period of rapid new development of parks and park facilities during the 50s and the early 60s, that expansion, that development is slowing by the 1970s. By the 1970s also, the baby boomers are becoming teenagers and young adults. By the end of the time period that I'm looking at here today, the mid-1980s, some baby boomers would have teenagers of their own. There was a general sort of embrace of rebellion, of doing your own thing, of letting it all hang out in this time, as has been studied by historians like Grace Hale in her book Nation of Outsiders and Thomas Frank in The Conquest of Cool. This included relaxed attitudes towards dating, drinking, and recreational drugs. Teenagers in this time period increasingly had their own cars and cash, but what they lacked and what they were seeking often were spaces of their own to escape to, where they could have privacy, a degree of anonymity, and cheap fun at a distance from parents, neighbors, teachers, and bosses. I think that really covers actually the entire time period being set out here from the early 50s through the mid 1980s, but it's becoming more and more prevalent, and teenagers are having more time, free time, and more money to spend over the period cumulatively. So I was just going to say a little bit about the earlier periods as a bit of deep context. During the 1950s, this was the period when governments across Canada were seeking to provide their citizens with all kinds of recreational amenities. Most provincial parks were free in this period. There weren't any entry fees. Campsites were free. Some parks even provided free firewood. Park agencies aspired to provide what one planner in BC called an atmosphere of congeniality and freedom. There was very little supervision or staff presence at most campgrounds, especially at night. During the 50s and the early 60s, I think that crowding was the biggest problem in Canada's parks. And And managers would blame crowding for much of the bad behavior that they identified amongst park visitors. So people camping in overflow areas or camping at picnic sites because they just couldn't find enough camp sites for them in the places they were designated to go. Parks were proving too popular for their own good. So far, I've basically found zero archival or newspaper sources suggesting that noise, alcohol, and boisterousness were major concerns for park managers during the 50s. But that starts to change by the early 1960s when the baby boomers are starting to enter their teens. The more research I'm doing on the 1960s, the early and mid 1960s, the more instances I'm finding of rowdyism becoming an issue in parks. Cultus Lake Provincial Park in British Columbia in the Fraser Valley is a major destination for this sort of activity. And I think that that's what this cartoon is responding to here. Boozy beach parties by high school students and university age students. There are major outbreaks of rowdyism that turn almost into riots at folk festivals in rural areas of Ontario. There's the big summer riots in 1964 and 1966 at the beach resort town of Grand Bend, Ontario, which Brian Palmer discusses in his book on Canada's 1960s. Camping in most provincial parks was still free in this time period. Parks were lightly staffed in the day and unstaffed at night, so there was often no one in authority around to supervise or receive complaints. And furthermore, most park employees didn't have much in the way of enforcement power. In Ontario provincial parks, for example, only a park superintendent had the power to evict a visitor, a guest, a client. From what I've found, the people who are participating in park rowdyism are high school students, but particularly college students. The biggest outbursts of rowdyism, of park takeovers, as they're sometimes characterized, seem to be happening between the Victoria Day 2-4 weekend and the end of the university school year. Sorry, what I meant to say there was the end of the grade school year. It's in the interval between when college lets out and when grade schools let out and families flood into provincial parks that most of the rowdyism is going on. So it seems to be very closely linked to college-age students. White, middle-class, and working-class suburban youth, often with an enthusiasm for motorcycles and hot rods and folk and rock and roll music. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, there's a great deal of concern in some localities about hippies and hitchhiking transient youth coming into parks, especially the national parks. And I've done a bit of work on Banff, and I'm doing a little bit of work currently on its cousin counterculture scene in Jasper, which lasted a bit longer. But hippies generally don't seem to have been a major problem in provincial parks. It was the sight of hippies, the smell of marijuana that irked park wardens and park visitors. But park agencies generally tried to provide for counterculture youth. The biggest problem for parks in this period wasn't a counterculture, but what I'm trying to trace is an emerging pattern of, I guess we could call it binge drinking, excessive drinking in Canadian parks by young people. And this is closely linked to changing alcohol laws. So this is just a really basic barometer. If you look at this cartoon from the summer of 1970, this is noisy, it's bawdy, it's a representation of a campground that is crowded and sort of déclassé, but it's not exactly threatening or frightening. Whereas a couple years later, the representation, albeit in different provinces, changed quite a bit. And I think a key event that's happened in here is the fact that every Canadian province dropped its legal drinking age from 21 to 18 or 19 in the interval, most of them in the summer of 1970. Young drinkers, as Craig Heron has described, proved to be avid drinkers. And in provincial parks and national parks and regional parks, they were free to drink more, and they didn't have to be discreet about it than at home. Uh, there was a lot of migrating across provincial and even national boundaries by young people to take advantage of the freedom that parks provided them to drink. This is especially common in people coming from Michigan to Ontario, for example, and a little bit from Washington State to BC as well, I've found. Complaints about rowdyism and bad behavior begin climbing sharply in this early 1970s period. And this is when you gradually begin to see an atmosphere of fear coming to surround some parks that have developed reputations as party parks. I'm slowly trying to build a little portfolio on how alcohol was advertised to young Canadians at this time using nature and outdoorsy themes, but that's slow going compared to the archival work. Now, initially in the early and mid 1970s, park authorities responded by implementing some new policy changes. They introduced campsite fees at provincial parks. Campsite fees were introduced to all provincial park systems during the early and mid 1970s, although not for all parks, mostly just for those that were the most popular and those that had developed problematic reputations for rowdyism and partying. Park agencies increased staffing, including late night patrols that could last until sunrise. In several provinces, there was a full-time police presence in parks. By 1971, the Ontario Provincial Police had summer detachments in at least 5 provincial parks. And in Saskatchewan, RCMP officers were stationed in several parks as well, so provincial parks, and national as well, I believe. There were new tighter regulations on alcohol in parks, so no longer were people allowed to take liquor out of their campsite. You couldn't take it onto a park road or down to the beach. It wasn't allowed in common areas. And there was special action in this time period against local problems. So in 1972, motorcycles were banned from the Pinery Provincial Park near London, Ontario, as a way of cracking down on motorcycle gangs that were sort of terrorizing staff and many other visitors. Motorcycle gangs are kind of an outlier here, but there was a growing popularity of using expensive recreational machinery in parks, from dune buggies and BMX to boogie vans in this time period. And this allowed young people to bring their own music with them. It provides them privacy within the privacy of the campground. It makes them highly mobile and very flexible in their travel patterns of where they choose to hang out on long weekends and so forth. And they also generate a lot of noise, which is a major point of complaint for other park users. During the period from, let's say, 1972 through 1985, youth unemployment was relatively high, and many adults' pockets were pinched as well. There was this broad cultural shift from prosperity and optimism to malaise and a sense of limits in this time period. So there's a growing desire for inexpensive escapism. There is, I think, a cultural embrace in many forms of music of sort of nihilism. So heavy metal music becomes a powerful undercurrent in pop music at this time, selling millions of albums, even without commercial airplay. There's a general musical embrace of noise, feedback, and harshness. And young people are making noise with transistor radios, ghetto blasters, and dune buggies. And they're using parks as a place to both seek privacy and to also prominently display defiance. So it's during the 80s that rowdies are said to become more confrontational with park staff, police, and campers who might complain about their behavior. And adults are also identified as becoming a growing problem in many accounts of rowdyism at this time period. And they have the argument that they've paid twice for the privilege of being free and wild. First, they've paid as taxpayers for the parks generally, and then they've paid their access fees as well, which is a difficult argument for many park wardens to counter. Other park users inundate uh, newspapers and politicians with complaints about youthful rowdyism in this time period, and it generates a whole range of responses. There's these consistent calls for crackdowns and so forth. In fact, many park users even admit that they would be willing to have their own recreational drinking in parks curtailed if it meant that it would eliminate the big problem of rowdyism, sort of as excessive, boisterous drinking in parks. There's a whole series of responses. Some parks consider giving wardens dogs and guns to maintain order and protect themselves from campers. Several agencies begin offering self-defense courses. Um, there's 24-hour quiet zones in some parks. There's 24-hour manned gates. There's increased street lighting. Parks are becoming more and more like urban or suburban areas in this time period. And parks officials are also given extra enforcement powers. It gets easier to evict visitors who are not behaving in a way that's deemed proper. It's a rough quantitative way of measuring this, but park evictions rise steadily through the late 70s and then sharply in the early 1980s. And then they flatten out, sort of plateau, and gradually go into decline. Although it's worth noting that eviction did become more complicated in the mid to late 1980s because of the problem of drinking and driving. It's no longer acceptable to evict drunken campers if it means putting them out onto the road. The liquor bans, increased security and policing, and expanded powers of eviction did tamp down on much of the wildness in Canadian parks during the 1980s. And the atmosphere of unease and fear that had come to surround many parks during the 1970s was lifted for the so-called silent majority. Um, but park yahoos and rowdyism never really disappeared, and this has given me a difficult time with the project about when to wrap it up exactly. Um, you know, as these recent news items suggest, the bans and rules didn't really rein in all small scale outbursts. So I'm sort of thinking right now that is it going to be more of a demographic tell that explains why this sort of eases off during the mid and late 1980s rather than simply policy changes in park enforcement. Maybe that's a question we can talk about later on because there simply hasn't been. That's where we start getting into the history of Generation X and even millennials by that time period. I will look forward to your questions during the session. I'm happy to tell you more about this, and I'll see you shortly.